Welcome to lecture number 2 of Post-Labor Economics. This is my series to get everyone spun up and on the same page as to the current state of post-labor economics as of 2025. This episode will be about economic agency, or about what do humans actually need to participate in the economy. So, before we dive in, let's do a recap of lecture 1, which was better, faster, cheaper, safer. TLDR, once machines are better, faster, cheaper, and safer than humans, it becomes economically inevitable that labor substitution happens. And one of the primary things, once we established what labor substitution is and why it would happen, was that we examined the economy from the 4 primary pillars of economic participants. So number 1 is consumers. That's you and me. Past economic paradigms would call it workers, but if workers are going away, then consumers become kind of the baseline. And consumers are the people who buy goods and services, or households is how it's often referred to. So consumers require economic agency through wages, property ownership, and democratic participation to meaningfully engage in society and markets. So you basically want money in the bank. That's, at the end of the day, from an economic perspective, that's what you want and that's what you need. How it gets there, we can discuss that. Second is businesses. Businesses face the paradox of wanting 0 employees to lower costs while needing customers with sufficient purchasing power. This is where the fundamental paradox breaks down, is that if you fire everyone, if every company fires everyone and replaces them with AI and robots, then none of your consumers or none of your customers have any money left. So therefore, the entire wage labor social contract breaks down, and therefore aggregate demand drops, and you end up in a death spiral. And that's what we're really going to focus on in this episode. The government's perspective wants to maintain tax revenue, demographic stability, and geopolitical position while providing minimal market intervention. That's what the government wants. However, if all of your citizens are unemployed, guess what? The citizens are going to rise up. We've seen this multiple times throughout history, where if economic agency gets too low, the chances of things like civil war and revolution go up. And certainly that's what we see is that's what has determined most of the outcomes of elections is kitchen table economics. Basically, how well the economy is treating consumers really determines the voting temperature, if you want to say it that way, in America. So the government doesn't necessarily care, like the government cares about jobs and working insofar as that's how the country is run. If that breaks down, then the government is concerned. And then banks. Banks function as economic infrastructure connecting all stakeholders, requiring depositors with money for transaction and debt servicing. From the bank's perspective, the bank wants to be issuing debt in the form of mortgages and loans and collecting interest. At a fundamental level, that's how the banks work. If their customers are broke, then the bank is just going to be foreclosing on everything. And, well, that's not the bank's business model. Foreclosures are a necessary evil to kind of try and recoup losses. But if everyone is fired, then they're going to have to foreclose on literally everything. This is what we saw during the Great Recession. The 2008 Great Recession was that foreclosures went up, and that's not nobody wins in that situation. So that's what we want to avoid as well. So when you look at the incentive structure for these 4 primary pillars, you can see that everyone wants the economy to keep going. But businesses will also want to fire all of their employees as soon as they can. So then what do you do to replace that? And this is all fundamentally coming because of what's called labor substitution. It's also called creative destruction, although that's more about you create a new industry by destroying an old one. So for instance, tractors and farm automation and farm machinery destroyed the old way of doing farms. So that way you created new industries such as the tractor industry. So creative destruction is kind of the large scale pattern, but labor substitution is what happens when a machine simply just replaces a human one-to-one. All right, so that's a recap of lecture 1. Now on to lecture 2. First and foremost, economic agency. You need to understand economic agency. Taking a big step back, whenever people say, I want my job, or, I want good health insurance or whatever, what you're really saying is that you want economic agency. Economic agency is the underpinning psychological need or civil principle that underpins the need for things like labor rights and those sorts of things. But to define economic agency represents an individual's capacity to shape their financial destiny through established rights and social mechanism. This foundational concept faces unprecedented disruption when automation eliminates traditional pathways to economic participation. There are three primary categories of economic agency in modern civil societies. Number one is labor rights. The right to work, organize, and negotiate fair compensation provides the primary avenue through which most people secure economic stability. If you remember from civics class, the labor organization and unionization was a really big thing a century ago. It's been declining here in America for about the last century. Because labor rights, or unions in particular, distort the market a little bit, and neoliberalism specifically became more hostile to unions. So we have a right to work paradigm right now, which is basically you can work for anyone at any time and you can be fired at any time, and there's not going to be any union interference. Now, while unions are really good for quality of life, they're very bad for economic efficiency in the grand scheme of things. It's a complicated story. I'm neither pro nor against union. They have served a purpose. But honestly, I just want to get away from work. So I want to get to a place where unions are irrelevant. That's my utopian goal. All right, so labor rights is pillar number one. Pillar number two is property rights. Ownership of assets enables wealth accumulation, financial security, and generational transfer of economic value. If you read the book Why Nations Fail, they really, really go into property rights as the cornerstone of progress. The ability to start a company and then make that company more valuable and then sell that company to someone else. The ability to create intellectual property, the ability to sell goods and services and to have ownership of those items or even some of those ideas through patent law. This is absolutely necessary for a modern liberal democracy to function. It is absolutely necessary for innovation and market progress. Now, I know some people out there have asked me questions, and I'll probably address this in a future video. What happens to things like copyright law and IP law in the future? That's a good question. I'll be talking to a lot of people about that coming up here soon. The third pillar is voting rights. So democratic participation allows citizens to influence economic policies, regulations, and structural opportunities. One of the most remarkable things about liberal democracies is that we can elect a new head of state, whether it's a president or prime minister or whatever. And so we can change the economic temperature. We can change the economic paradigm relatively quickly in democratic societies. Generally, every 4 years. Then, of course, you have staggered midterm elections. So you have state and federal. So you have two tiers, and then you have House of Representatives, Senate, and presidency. At least here in America. And through indirect means, we can really change the tune or change the tempo of how we feel about the way that the economy is going. That is a huge, huge innovation over stagnant monarchies and other totalitarian and authoritarian regimes, namely Russia and China right now, North Korea as well, although they're not as major of a player on the global stage. So this trifecta forms the social contract right now. So there was a very silly comment on the first lecture that said, I didn't sign no social contract, missing the point. Anyways, the social contract basically is the implicit or explicit agreed upon paradigm where you have labor rights, property rights, and voting rights, and the rest is more or less up to you to figure out how to navigate the society. As we talked about in Lecture 1, labor rights might become irrelevant. It might become a moot point if nobody's willing to hire you because of automation, because of AI, robots. Globalization and offshoring has been the biggest threat. Immigration has also been a big threat for the last few decades. Now there's a new threat to jobs. Even if there's work to be done, there's no physical reason that it must be a human doing that work. And that's where automation comes in. So that is the principle of economic agency. What comes next is economic agency paradox. So here's economic agency paradox in a nutshell. Automation simultaneously promises liberation from mundane labor while threatening the economic foundations of consumer purchasing power. This central contradiction creates potential systemic collapse when wage earning opportunities vanish, but consumer spending remains essential. In other words, if you don't have a job, you don't spend any money, And if you don't spend any money, the economy collapses. And the reason that is the main paradox is because we'll have this automation ability to turn the economy red hot, but instead it's actually going to stall unless we can shore up aggregate demand. So what is aggregate demand? Aggregate demand is modern economic systems fundamentally rely on widespread consumer purchasing power to drive production, innovation, and growth. The fact that we have, I think in America, there's like 148 million or 160 million households. Every household needs to buy electricity, goods, computers, internet services, food, all of that. So that is what we call aggregate demand. From a macroeconomic policy, from a national policy perspective, you say, okay, everyone can find their own ways to make money. Everyone has their own way of meeting, their needs for economic agency, whether you want to be a landlord, whether you want to be a programmer, whether you want to be a venture capitalist. Doesn't matter at the individual level when you're looking at it from a national level. At the national level, you just want to say how much money are consumers willing and able to spend in the economy on an annual or quarterly basis. And so if jobs go down, aggregate demand goes down, and that is one of the key metrics that is measured and tracked to keep the economy running. As we already talked about labor substitution, competitive pressures inevitably drive businesses to adopt automation that eliminates human employment across all sectors. As soon as a machine is better, faster, cheaper, and safer, it becomes inevitable that you're going to fire humans in favor of the machine. That has always happened. Same reason that we don't have that many farm hands anymore is because modern combines, John Deere replaces literally millions of man hours worth of labor, and you can just have Jeremy Clarkson up on his big Lamborghini tractor do hundreds of human man hours worth of labor from his tractor, and he's like 70 something years old. Right. So that has been the nature of automation. It's just now automation is getting more intelligent. And also automation is taking our form factor, not just the shape of a tractor. Automation is going to take the shape of human bodies, where they're going to be more dexterous, more agile, stronger, and be able to work around the clock. So labor substitution becomes inevitable eventually. Now, some of you out there in the comments have been asking, when is this going to happen? I've been trying to model the uptake of this. So for software as a service, the TLDR is that adoption curves are about 7 to 8 years from an introduction of a new technology to 80 to 90% saturation. So this is year one of computer using agents. So that means that it's like at the ground floor right now. And that means that in 7 to 8 years, so about 2031, 2032, 2033, we're going to be at 80 to 90+% saturation, meaning every company that can do KVM jobs, that's keyboard, video, mouse jobs, will have very few employees doing those jobs. And of course, there might be limits to what those computer using agents can do, but that labor substitution is coming. It's going to take a little bit longer for robots to really scale up, and that's just because supply lines, factories, the marginal cost of creating more robots is always higher than just creating more agents, because an agent is an ephemeral piece of software. It's just data. Anyways, moving on. So if we end up with this scheme where labor substitution is happening broad spectrum very quickly, then aggregate demand goes down and we end up in an economic death spiral. Declining wages lead to reduced consumer spending, triggering business failures, innovation stagnation, and comprehensive economic collapse. I am not the only person afraid of this. Everyone from Goldman Sachs to Brookings Institute to World Economic Forum, everyone at the highest echelons of global economics is looking at, how do we solve this contradiction? How do we solve this paradox? And it doesn't, and as many of you have pointed out in the comments, it doesn't even have to get to 100%. If we just get to 20 or 30% unemployment, that's bad enough. Consider that I think the highest unemployment we saw during the Great Depression was 25 to 28%, and that was catastrophic. So if we get to 20% unemployment, that would already be catastrophic to most people, but we're looking at 30 to 40% unemployment as a very real possibility due to artificial intelligence and robots. That would be catastrophic. The fundamental problem is distribution. The core challenge involves allocating purchasing power without traditional wage mechanisms when machines generate economic value. Right now, the primary distribution mechanism is you find work. So like the decentralized, distributed social hive mind of humanity, you're trying to find work. So there's the labor market. So there's supply and demand of labor. So you find the most valuable job that you can do. And that is how we, and the invisible hand, although to be fair, Adam Smith only used invisible hand once or twice, and it was never really directly in, it was not referring to the market as a whole. Anyways, the invisible hand of the market is rational self-interest where, hey, I don't want to starve and I don't want to lose my house, so let me go find the best job that I can do. And the best job that's out there that I can do is someone needs me to do something, right? So if that distribution problem breaks down, we need a replacement distribution mechanism. And as you'll see by the end of this video, property makes the most sense. Decentralized markets, current markets distribute wealth through labor wage exchanges based on scarcity principles that become invalid when automation eliminates labor demand, or basically eliminates labor scarcity. Economies are always based on optimizing around scarcity. Right now, human labor is actually the scarcest input to all economic activity. That's why building a house, like the single biggest bucket that money goes into for building a house is labor. It's 30 to 40% of the cost of a house is the labor that went into it. That's more than any other single asset or resource, unless it's a house that sits on a really big piece of land. As we're drilling deeper into this problem, you say, okay, from a macro perspective, we want to shore up aggregate demand. Where does aggregate demand come from? Consumer purchasing power flows primarily from three sources which require fundamental rebalancing in an automated economy. The current distribution heavily favors wages that would be dramatically reduced through automation displacement. So those three buckets are wages. Labor compensation constitutes approximately 60% of total consumer demand in the current economy. Property. Asset ownership generates roughly 20% of consumer purchasing power through dividends, rents, and capital gains. Transfers. Government disbursements accounts for approximately 19% of customer spending through retirement, unemployment, SNAP, and other entitlement programs. That also includes Medicare and Medicaid. So basically, some of your ability to demand goods and services comes from the government. And this is in aggregate. Now, some of you might say, but actually 90% of my income comes from wages. If you're a prime age worker, which is 25 to 54, there is a good chance that the majority of your income, your purchasing power, comes from wages. It's only once you get older, or if you're born rich or whatever, that more will come from property. And also only once you're older or disabled or whatever that you get more of it from transfers. It also varies per county. So one of the things that, as I've been researching this, poor rural counties will have up to 30% transfers, sometimes a little bit more, whereas rich, high-tech counties will have very, very low very low transfers and higher property and wages. So that's one of the fundamental differences. So this ratio is going to shift. Automation will significantly diminish wages as primary source of consumer purchasing power, creating fundamental economic imbalance. Again, if wages go down, property and transfers have to pick up the slack. Transfers would be UBI, but we don't want to overly rely on UBI. So that's the necessary adjustments. So here's a way to visualize it. Right now, the aggregate demand in America is roughly 60-20-20. So that's the current income mix of wages. So in aggregate, looking at all of America, if you were to put it all into one big giant bucket, 60% of aggregate demand comes from wages, 20% comes from property, and 20% comes from transfers. Now, wages are not going to go away completely. As we've talked about in plenty of other videos, many jobs are going to be vulnerable to automation. In fact, most jobs, or a significant portion of jobs, are going to be vulnerable to automation. Pretty much anything that you do in front of a computer, vulnerable to automation. Skilled labor, such as electricians and plumbers, once robots really take off in the late 2030s, mid to late 2030s, all of those jobs are going to be vulnerable as well. Now, typically in the past, labor dislocation has created jobs elsewhere, but as I have stated in this lecture series and in other places, just because demand goes up or there's hypothetical capital that has been liberated for other things, there's not really any reason that those new services and goods must be provided by humans. Historically, those new goods and services were provided by humans just because we didn't have automation. So, in the future, though, we can expect wages to go down dramatically, There's still going to be plenty of things, the experience economy, the meaning economy, attention economy, all of those are probably going to stick around. Humans just intrinsically find humans interesting, and we find interactions with humans to be more rewarding, unless you're ultra autistic like some of us. And I'd prefer to interact with machines. Ask me about when I had to buy a new car from a car dealership. It was the worst experience that I've had all year. Anyways, rant aside, the mix that we probably want to see in the future is something more like this, where you have 20% of aggregate demand comes from residual wages, 60% comes from property, and only 20% comes from transfers. Now you might argue that you want this to go up a little bit more, but what if we just replace a lot of those entitlement programs with UBI and everyone gets it? So instead of retirement, instead of Medicare and SNAP and all of those other things, what if everyone just gets a UBI? But this is just a good visualization, so you get a basic idea. Also, I apologize if I'm in front of the graphic, but you get the idea. So this is where we're at. This is where we want to be. So then the question becomes, how do we increase the amount of property that people have? We're going to dive into that and all the interventions that we can do in a future video, but we'll do a little bit in this video. So first and foremost, though, UBI, necessary but not sufficient. This is one of my most unpopular opinions with some people. So let's dive into it. Universal basic income represents an essential but incomplete solution to the automation displacement problem, providing a minimum economic floor while requiring substantial tax increases to fund implementation. Number one, central control. Government administration creates problematic financial dependency and excessive state influence over citizen economic freedom. First and foremost, you do not want to put all your eggs in one basket, and you do not want to be a financial patient of the government. Just look at how, when someone accidentally gets their checks cut off and the government is too slow and too incompetent to say, oh, well, someone filed it wrong and here's a death certificate that says that you died, so now you're actually committing fraud. And this happens all the time, by the way, with Social Security checks. So you do not want central control where an apathetic, incompetent, slow-moving bureaucracy is responsible for your entire economic fate. Next is market distortions. Pure UBI implementation undermines critical price signals by treating recipients identically regardless of circumstances or location. One of the strengths of UBI is that it's equal for everyone. That's also one of the weaknesses of UBI. It doesn't matter, cost of living is going to change, your individual needs are going to change. So one of the primary problems with UBI is that it's like, let's just say the UBI is $2,000 per adult citizen. Okay, is that really gonna work if you're in New York City or San Francisco? It's going to be a really big difference if you're out in rural Wyoming, where $2,000 a month might be all that you really need. In New York City or San Francisco, that's not even going to cover a third of rent. So UBI would then encourage different migration patterns and those sorts of things. So that is technically a kind of market distortion where everyone gets the same thing. So UBI is necessary, but you don't want it to be too high. Now, I know some people are like, what about what Elon Musk said with universal high income? Elon Musk is not a banker, and he's also not a governance expert, so take everything Elon Musk says about UHI with a grain of salt. Now, what I will agree with, though, is that's the ultimate goal. By the time post-labor economics is fully implemented by around 2040, I hope, we'll be on an upward trajectory where you'd be getting the equivalent of $120,000 per year without doing anything in today's dollars. So next is inflation. Increased currency velocity without corresponding production growth threatens purchasing power erosion through inflationary pressure. This is one of the things that we saw with the stimulus checks that went out with during the pandemic, is they were very popular, but they also did cause some inflation. Now, we also know that some of the inflation was due to other distortions such as shipping problems. If demand goes down, if supply goes down and demand stays the same, then prices go up. So the pandemic inflation was complicated, but certainly, spending trillions of dollars on stimulus checks was a part of it. So that is a not solved problem in terms of, even if we wanted to do UBI tomorrow, there's going to be unintended consequences. Next is tax flight. Excessive taxation required for funding UBI risks triggering capital exodus and talent migration for more favorable jurisdictions. The more taxes you pay, the more acutely you are aware of and trying to optimize your tax havens. In some of the conversations, that are having and that are going to continue is some of this has to actually be a global solution so that you pay taxes anywhere. Some of the things that people are proposing is a global wealth fund, so that wherever you go, if a billionaire leaves America and goes to Europe or Australia or somewhere else, they're still going to be paying taxes to a global wealth fund. This is just a hypothetical. I don't know if that's a good idea, but that's just one of the ideas being floated out there. Now, another thing to keep in mind is that UBI does not have to come from federal. One of the oversights that I see out there in the conversations is that UBI must be a federal thing or a global thing. But when you look at some of the experiments being done, there are UBIs that are being trialed at the municipal, state, and federal levels. So what that can do is you might actually ultimately end up getting UBI checks from your city, from your county, from your state, and your federal government, which is better because you're not getting it all from one place, and it can be adjusted to the cost of living to your particular city or state, hypothetically speaking. Now, next is the property overhaul. So if you believe this graph and you say, all right, we need more property, but what if people don't have any buy-in? What are some ways that we can create this new property paradigm without buy-in? Because obviously, if you already have money, you can buy into this new system, and who cares? But most people don't have the spare income to buy into this new scheme. So how do you create a paradigm in which you can? Now, I've been doing some work on this, and I actually have a blog post, link above or below or wherever, where I've got 16 different interventions that can be employed that require various levels of buy-in. But I wanted to provide just an overview of a couple of options that are pretty potent and familiar. So alternative ownership structures must expand dramatically to maintain economic agency when wages collapse. That's the entire point of post-labor economics. Numerous proven models exist to distribute asset ownership broadly across the population. Number one is trusts. Public and private trust structures enable collective ownership of capital assets, sharing returns across broad beneficiary populations. Now, some trusts you need to buy into, some you don't. Some are based on residency. So the Alaska Permanent Fund, the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, all of those are just based on citizenship and residency. No buy-in is required. And furthermore, the fact that trusts are very well tested, they're constitutionally sound, the governance is well understood, we have established best practices, trust could be a good component. Now, as many of you will point out, a trust alone doesn't really make that big of a difference if it only pays out, $1,000 a year or $2,000 a year. But when you have a portfolio of many of these interventions, like I said, I've got a list of 16 interventions, they add up and they also accumulate and compound over time. So next is wealth funds. So sovereign and community wealth funds create public endowments generating returns for citizens without relying on wage income. These also exist. There's actually a proposal right now of creating a national sovereign wealth fund here in America. I don't know if it's going to get created, but I think the number that they were floating was something like $5 trillion, which sounds like a lot, but that's only going to generate, a few $100s to a few $1,000s per citizen per year. But it's a start and it can grow over time. Next is stock options. So there's all kinds of ways that you can create stock options. So first is an ESOP, which is an employee stock option plan. So if you work somewhere, you can take part of your wages in the form of shares. I did this when I worked at Cisco, and it was great because Cisco kept a pool of shares and would give them to you at a discount I think it was every quarter or every month. So I put like 20% of my salary towards shares, which I then got at a discount. So it was like an immediate 20% boost to my income. So that's one option. But if wages go away, if employment goes away for most cases, then that's not really an option on the table. So then another few options are, one is a customer equity program, which is basically you add on like a 1 to 4 or 5% sales tax. And so every time you purchase something from a store, you actually get a fractional share. And so every time you spend, you get more, and then you get dividends on those shares over time. So the longer you patronize, it's like a kickback program or a rewards program. You get a Target card, you get a rebate, right? You get sometimes you get $5 back immediately. It's that kind of thing, but instead of just immediate cash back, you get shares. Another one is where you'd have transfer ownership via taxes. So basically, a company could pay some of their taxes, their corporate taxes, in the form of shares given to wealth funds. Particularly non-voting dividend-generating shares would be the ideal way to go. Cashback programs such as loyalty systems. So that's like, your credit card and your flyer miles and stuff. Those are loyalty programs, and other local incentives. So, for instance, getting more cash back if you spend locally, or participate in circular economies. Cooperatives, so royalties from carbon sequestration, spectrum, solar, data centers, and other infrastructure cooperatives. All of these all exist. And these are just 5 of the 16 interventions that I've identified so far. So the idea here, though, is that some of these do require some buy-in, or buy-in is optional. But the more property you have, you end up starting up a flywheel where the investments and the reinvestments from those compound over time. Now, I have modeled this, and we'll talk about this more in the modeling and measurements and KPI in the future lectures. But I just wanted to prime the pump with some ideas up front. Next is market-based solutions. Basically, you want as little government intervention as possible. So market-based solutions is one of the primary goals of post-labor economics, is finding decentralized, distributed methods. So market-based approaches offer superior alternatives to centrally planned systems while preserving economic agency in a post-labor world. These solutions align with established economic frameworks while distributing ownership broadly across the population. Property primacy, number 1. Strong private property rights form the foundation of all economically successful nations and must be expanded to include more citizens. We want to double down on property rights, we not go the other way where you will own nothing and be happy. I'm literally saying the opposite of you will own nothing and be happy. This is a solar punk future where you own everything, and the elites own less. And certainly the government owns less. Market solutions. Allowing competitive forces to allocate resources produces more efficient outcomes than centralized management by government entities or larger polities or billionaires. Next is the coordination mechanism. New frameworks must replace wage labor social contract as automation eliminates traditional employment relationships. Property is the new coordination mechanism. You vote with your wallet and also your zip code and your shopping cart. Next is participatory ownership. Collective purchasing power through counties and banks enables individuals to aggregate resources and acquire meaningful ownership stakes. This is one of the key things that people have brought up as concerns in the comments is, if I don't have any purchasing power at the beginning, how do I buy in? In the same way that unions allowed for collective bargaining of labor rights, your bank, your credit union, and your county will allow for collective purchasing power so that you can punch above your weight and say, hey, we want to build a world-class solar farm or data center or something else in this county. So let's join forces. And it's not necessarily just, approve the county to take out a loan. There's better ways of doing it. And number 1, voluntary adoption. The most effective solutions must naturally attract all stakeholders, banks, businesses, governments, and consumers, through mutual benefit rather than mandate. One of the biggest mistakes that governments could make is doing a lot of this through force, basically saying you must do all these new things. Now, that's not to say that some things must be compulsory. Taxes, for instance, there's many aspects that are compulsory, but really the finesse, the nuanced approach is going to be creating options that are voluntary and organic. And so those will create the fewest market distortions, and they'll also be adopted the most organically and naturally. The role of banks. So we're almost done. Banks serve as the central hub of the post-labor economic ecosystem, providing critical infrastructure and services. Financial institutions from local credit unions to international centers will become your primary economic touchpoint as labor income diminishes. In other words, your relationship with your bank or banks will replace your relationship with your employers. So first and foremost, banks are user-friendly. One of the main concerns that I've seen percolating up is, Dave, everything that you're proposing sounds great, but it sounds so complex. Not everyone is going to be able to manage it, and I absolutely agree, which is why it should be managed through your bank. And by the way, you can choose your bank. You can choose which credit union or which commercial bank or retail bank you go with. So the market efficiency for discovery will still be there. The competition between banks for customers will still be there. And fundamentally, you say, well, what are they competing over? UBI is necessary in that that's where some money is injected at the bottom. So essentially, banks will be competing over some of the UBI that everyone is getting, plus the other business that they generate. But number 1, banks are user-friendly. Financial institutions translate complex economic paradigms into accessible interfaces through local branches and mobile apps that manage sophisticated ownership mechanisms. From your perspective, you just get money in the bank. You can make more decisions. You can play with it like you play with stock markets and those sorts of things. You're welcome to do that, but most people are probably just going to delegate it to the bank. Say, manage it for me. All I want to see is my dividends accruing every week. Next up is KYC expertise, so know your customer. Banks provide established solutions for identity management, security, privacy, and compliance that emerging technologies like blockchain and DAOs have yet to solve effectively. So basically, proof of humanity. Sam Altman is trying to solve this problem that doesn't really exist with his WorldCoin orb thing. Nobody cares, right? The banks don't really care. Banks have ways of establishing your identity. If anything, blockchain-based and crypto-based solutions will just be an additional layer on top of it. But at the same time, proof of stake and proof of ownership, that's what banks are for. That's literally why banks have existed for hundreds of years. So yeah, that's a solved problem. And so this creates an anchor where maybe all of your crypto and all of your tokens and all of your proof of stake tokens go through your bank. I would like to see that as an option. Next is investment management. Banking professionals automatically handle diverse investment accounts, dividends, kickbacks, and depositing proceeds without customer intervention while managing regulatory compliance. Again, it compresses it all into a service. And so the service that you get is they make sure that you get your dividends. They make sure that you get your voting rights. They make sure that you get your cooperative rebates and everything else. And they handle the complexity. And what they get is servicing fees, and they get to service your debt as well. So that's the mutually beneficial relationship between you and banks, which banks already do that right now, but they're pretty conservative with it. You can get a CD account, which will pay 3% per year, but we need to get that up to 8 to 12% per year. Next is technical nerve center. Financial institutions connect with all payment rails such as ACH, FedNow, RTP, and can replace employers as the command center of economic well-being through voluntary association. Again, by choosing where you bank and which banks you qualify for, just in some cases, just by being a member of a bank, you will start to reap some of those benefits. And then the direct incentives. Banks, particularly local institutions, have inherent motivation to adopt post-labor economic models as they benefit directly from customer financial success through deeper community investment. So incentive alignment between you and your local bank will ensure that they actually want to adopt these policies in the long run. And then role of counties. So the other centerpiece of post-labor economics is going to be your local county, mostly due to the principle of subsidiarity or economic subsidiarity. And this is the last slide, I promise. Counties provide the ideal governing scale to implement and test post-labor economic initiatives. That's not saying that it should be limited to counties. States and federal governments will participate as well, but starting with counties is good because we have 3,100 counties here in America. So that's a lot of test beds. Their unique position in the governance hierarchy offers operational advantages while maintaining community connection. Number one is the scale of sweet spot, or the sweet spot scale. Counties are small enough to implement changes without gridlock, yet large enough to generate meaningful economic data and serve as scalable models. They also control the most zoning information. Next is economic asset control. Counties directly own valuable revenue-generating assets including land, utility franchises, infrastructure easements, and zoning authority that can feed community endowment funds. This is also true of states, by the way. Again, I'm just recommending that we start with counties just because they're small, there's many of them, and there's going to be a lot more flexible testing. Next is existing infrastructure. Implementation leverages established county systems for property records, tax assessment, residency verification, and dividend disbursement without building from scratch. So rather than trying to reinvent the wheel, we can just start with counties that already exist, and we can empower counties with some more of these economic tools, meaning that, in a post-labor economy, some of your income, some of your residual income is going to be coming directly from the county, some from the state, some from the federal government, and other voluntary choices like who you bank with, and so on and so forth. And then as an ideological testing ground, the political diversity across counties enables cross-partisan validation of post-labor economic models while revealing region-specific opportunities like solar co-ops or timber royalties or carbon sequestration or whatever else. And then community legitimacy. Local governance fosters accountability and trust when residents receive economic benefits as county officials live alongside constituents affected by their decisions. This is the primary principle of subsidiarity, which is push all the decisions out to as local as you can. And this includes economic decisions, which is one of the cornerstones of post-labor economics. Thank you for watching to the end. Episode 3 or Lecture 3 will be about measurements and KPI. What do you measure? How do you know if you're vulnerable for post-labor economics? How do you know if you're ready? How do you know if it's going right? So on and so forth. Yeah, that's it. Thanks for watching. Cheers.